today, we're travelling back to 1945, but we're doing it in a very specific way. We're leaving all our hindsight at the door. We're going to experience this incredible year as it actually happened, through the eyes of journalists who were right there on the ground. And what they saw, what they wrote about, wasn't some simple story of triumph. It was a year of victory, absolutely, but one that was just riddled with profound anxiety.
We've broken this down into 4 parts. First, we'll look at the deep cracks that were forming in the Allied coalition. Then, we'll witness the final violent collapse of the Third Reich. After that, we'll walk through the ruins of a defeated Germany. And finally, we'll watch as the victors try to build a new world, even as they were already starting to drift apart themselves.
Right, so let's get into it. The year 1945 did not open with some big confident celebration. Far from it. It actually began with frustration, a stalemate on the battlefield, and a surprising amount of bickering behind the scenes.
That quote we started with, it came from this very issue. The editors said there was a need for some very plain speaking to act as a safety valve. The relationship wasn't just a bit strained, it was hitting a breaking point over what to do in Greece, in Poland, and a dozen other simmering arguments.
I mean, the sheer range of complaints was just staggering. You had American critics accusing Britain of being everything at once, too tough on Russia, then too soft, of not pulling their weight in the fight, while somehow also stealing a commercial advantage. And the British, well, they were just sick and tired of what they saw as American hypocrisy, coming from a country that, in their view, sat on the sidelines during the most desperate days of the war. Trust was wearing incredibly thin. And all this political gloominess, it was perfectly mirrored on the battlefield. The new year kicked off not with a final glorious charge, but with a real sense of disappointment.
You see, after the breakout from Normandy, pretty much everyone hoped the war would be over by Christmas '44, but the advance just stalled. The German army, which had looked like it was about to completely collapse, had somehow managed to stabilise the front and even launch a huge counterattack in the Ardennes. The Allies were well and truly stuck.
And The Economist made this absolutely crucial point. The Allies were actually accidentally helping the enemy. Their political squabbling gave the Nazis hope that the whole coalition might just fall apart. And because the Allies hadn't laid out any clear peace terms, it let Goebbels convince the German people that surrender meant total annihilation. It gave them the most compelling reason to fight on, just to survive. But then, in the spring, everything changed. The deadlock didn't just break, it was utterly shattered in one of the fastest, most violent military collapses in all of history. The speed of it all was just breathtaking. I mean, look at this. On March 7th, the first Allied troops get across the Rhine. By the beginning of April, Allied tanks are just pouring across the German plains. And by the first week of May, it was all over. An entire nation had been overrun in less than 2 months. And the crossing of the Rhine, that was the moment. That was the game changer. It was Germany's last great natural defence. Once the Allies were across, the German military machine just disintegrated. There was nothing left to stop the tide. As May began, the end of the regime was brutally, horribly clear. Mussolini had been executed by partisans, and Hitler, according to reports out of Hamburg, was dead. And this was no heroic Wagnerian last stand. No, the Nazi leadership just dissolved in a frenzy of score-settling, suicides, and desperate attempts to flee. As the magazine put it, it was a gangster's end. Total, squalid, and pathetic. So, victory was achieved. The war in Europe was finally over, but that moment of triumph was immediately followed by a chilling, confusing, and brand new reality. The fighting had stopped, sure, but what was left in its place? Well, the answer was a void, a human catastrophe on a scale that's almost impossible to wrap your head around. To try and understand this, let's follow a special correspondent for The Economist who travelled into Bavaria in June 1945, just a few weeks after the surrender. He described the journey as being like something out of a dream. This right here is the heart of what he saw. German society hadn't just been defeated, it had effectively ceased to exist. The entire nation had dissolved into millions of isolated individuals, each one just consumed by their own private fears and worries. There was no Germany left, only Germans. Our correspondent noted 4 key things. First, that feeling of atomization we just talked about. Second, a huge psychological shift where Germans suddenly saw themselves purely as victims, conveniently forgetting their role as accomplices. Third, the roads were just a chaotic torrent of humanity, surrendered soldiers, refugees, liberated slave labourers, camp survivors, and finally, the Allied military government had banned all political activity, creating a total political vacuum. And it was into this vacuum that the victors now had to step, facing the enormous task of building a new world order, all while their own alliance was visibly cracking. So, in July, you have the big 3 leaders meeting at Potsdam, just outside the ruins of Berlin.
They were no longer just war leaders, now they were the architects of the peace, and their blueprints for the future couldn't have been more different. This is how The Economist framed the central conflict that was about to define the next 50 years. On one side, America, representing the completely unplanned society. On the other, the Soviet Union, the completely planned. Two fundamentally opposed ideas about how the world should work, now staring each other down over the corpse of Europe. And then, right in the middle of the Potsdam Conference, a political bombshell drops. The results of the British general election come in, and Winston Churchill, the man who embodied the fight against Hitler, was unceremoniously voted out of office. A new Labour government took power, adding yet another layer of uncertainty at this incredibly critical moment. Then, just 2 weeks later, a new and terrible force entered the world stage. The atomic bombs fell on Japan, bringing the Second World War to its final shuddering end. A terrifying new chapter in human history had begun. The war was won, but that victory, delivered by a weapon of unthinkable power, didn't bring peace of mind. It ushered in a whole new age of anxiety, a new set of fears for a world that had only just survived the old ones. The year of victory was also, it turns out, the year the Cold War and the atomic age truly